We are in the part of the course that deals with empiricism. That is to say, the view that our knowledge of the world comes from experience of the world. It comes ultimately from perception, and that our logical faculties that enable us to draw conclusions from what we perceive. In ethics, what that means is that we learn from, well, experience of the world what to do and what not to do. And we're going to look at one theory today, inspired by Aristotle, but nevertheless taking things in a different direction from the one Aristotle did, that remains very popular today. There are still lots of people who consider themselves utilitarians. It's one of the main contemporary approaches to ethics. The utilitarians hold generally one simple principle. And there are different ways of expressing that principle, as we'll see. But if I try to put it in sort of everyday language, here are two attempts at it. One is just act for the best. Okay, try to improve the world as much as possible in what you're doing. Produce as much happiness for as many people as possible. So act for the best. Do the thing that will have the best results. And a second attempt would be make the world a better place. Try to leave the world a better place than you found it, not only in a whole lifetime, but in each individual action. Try to improve the overall happiness level of the world. So those are two ways of thinking about the basic utilitarian command. The principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, it just says, basically, you want to improve the world. You want to make people happy. Now, there are some complications. And there are also ways of locating this on a map of different approaches to ethics. So let's start there. There are different kinds of moral theory, different things that you might take as basic. Think about what it is to actually act and reach a decision, implement an action. You might say you start with a certain character. You are the person you are. You have certain traits of character, and that helps to shape what you're going to do. Then you form a particular motive. You decide to act for a certain reason, a certain purpose. There are lots of ways in which we might talk about that, and if we really wanted to zero in on that, it would be complicated. We tend to have certain goals, and those goals relate to what we think we're doing overall, our overall projects, and we think about those goals and then have reasons to act, and have motivations to act based on trying to achieve those goals. So a motive is just what we'll say is that complex of things involving goals and purposes, choosing means to attain our ends. It gives us a motive or a reason for action. And then, of course, there's the action itself. We actually do what we were thinking about doing. Let's say we reach a decision, we do this, and then, in the end, that has certain results, has certain effects. Now, if we went in with more of a microscope, we could say between the motive and the action, there's actually a lot of stuff going on. I form an intention, for example, based on my goals and my reasons for action, and so forth. But for now, let's just think about it as consisting of these four stages. Aristotle focuses on the first and says, let's think about character. Think about what a virtuous person would be. And let's examine the traits of character that are good, that are to be sought, that we can consider as virtues, and then those that we would want to avoid and consider vices. Immanuel Kant, whom we'll look at later in the course, focuses on motives, on reasons for action, on what he calls maxims, subjective principles of action, and says that's what we really need to focus on. That's the key thing in ethics. Why are you doing this? What's your reason? What's your motivations for doing it? A traditional way of looking at ethics is to just say, look, it's just a question of the action itself. Did you keep the promise or did you break the promise? Did you murder that person or did you not murder that person? Did you steal the car or did you not steal the car? And you might say, look, I don't care what kind of person you are exactly when I'm evaluating this. I don't really care what your motive was. I just look at the action. Was it an act of murder? If so, it's wrong. Is it an act of stealing? If so, it's wrong. And then you can look at effects. And that's what the utilitarian does. The utilitarian says, in the end, the thing that matters primarily, that everything else depends on, is a question of results, the effects, the consequences of the action. So if Aristotle starts at one end and says, let's think about traits of character as the fundamental thing in ethics, then the utilitarian goes to the other side and says, no, it's a question of effects. We want results. Act for the best results. Try to improve the world as much as possible. That's a concern for consequences, having a certain result of your action. Well, the person who really put utilitarianism on the map, not the first person to think of it or to examine it, But really the first to develop it into a comprehensive philosophical system was Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was a British philosopher who, as you can see, lived at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. He was a remarkable sort of character. He spent much of his life doing what his friends called vibrating, which meant essentially pacing and thinking of ideas. He had a small desk at which he wrote, something like this one, and he would pace around the room like this, thinking, and then he would sit down at the desk and scribble. He spent much of his life doing this. He decided that writing in traditional longhand was much too inefficient, and so he developed his own shorthand and left thousands of pages of material, all written in his own particular shorthand. There were only a few people in the world who could read it. There is something right now called the Bentham Project at the University of London that is going through and trying to translate all of this and translate it from his shorthand, that is to say, into normal English, and then publish all of this. They project that there are going to be between 70 and 80 volumes at the end of writing throughout his life. He saw himself as bringing scientific method to morality. That's why he focuses on results. He wants something that is observable, that we can directly perceive, that is the foundation for moral judgments, and also political judgments. His main work is called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Morals, individual morality in other words, but also legislation. So he's trying to tell you what to do as an individual, but also trying to tell us what to do as a collective group of people. Now, part of this was that he was hostile to things like conscience or traditional morality. He considered himself a philosophical radical, and to debunk superstitions, in this case about death. After he died, he had his body stuffed and put on display in a glass case at the library at the University of London, of which he was one of the founders. So it's still there. You can go and you can look at Jeremy Bentham, and that is a bronze cast of his head taken after he died. The actual head is down there at his feet, now shrunken and shriveled. A few years ago, he had to be sent to Germany to be debunked, literally. But in any case, he took this to a sort of extreme. He wanted, by the way, a few years ago, it would have been his 250th birthday, and a bunch of us had a conference in his honor, and they actually set up a video connection to Jeremy Bentham in London. So we were all talking to what is called the auto icon, his body in the glass case. It was an extremely creepy experience. In any event, there is a webcam on it, so at any time you can say, well, how's Jeremy doing today? And check out the webcam on the auto icon. Now, here is how Jeremy Bentham puts this principle that is the foundational principle in An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. He says, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. Or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. Now that's the way he always writes, or almost always writes. And so even once you've got it out of the shorthand, it's not exactly always enjoyable to read. Nevertheless, Bentham is actually a very clear thinker who follows out certain trains of reasoning very sharply. And so here we've got actually a very complicated principle. If this were an upper division course, we'd take it apart phrase by phrase to see all the various components of that. But for now, what I want to point out is that it's actually, in a lot of ways, very similar to how John Stuart Mill puts it. Utilitarianism became popular as a moral theory, largely because not of Bentham, who published very little of what he wrote during his lifetime, but of his student John Stuart Mill. Mill was a child prodigy, as Bentham was. Bentham ended up going to Oxford at age 12 and getting a law degree by age 19, even though he never practiced law. John Stuart Mill was similarly a prodigy. He was educated at home by his father, James Mill, an economist, and also by Jeremy Bentham. So he never actually went to school or university or anything like that. Nevertheless, he was one of the great minds of the 19th century. Maybe I shouldn't say nevertheless. If you're taught by a famous economist and a famous philosopher, maybe it's precisely because of that he became one of the great minds of the 19th century. And here's how he put the principle. He said, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So to what extent is this action right? To the extent that it promotes happiness. And that expresses the key idea much more directly. Yes? Ah, good, exactly. It is the happiness of everyone that is in question here, not just the happiness of an individual. Absolutely. So, if we look at what Bentham says in particular, for example, he says to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. But right away we have to ask, well, whose interest is in question? The answer is anybody who might be affected by that action. So not just the person doing it. They are not saying, act so that you'll be as happy as possible. They are saying, act so that as many people, so that the sum total of happiness is as large as possible. So you have to think about everyone who might be affected to promote happiness, not just your own, but anybody's happiness. Now, that, as soon as you think about that, you realize, ooh, wait a minute, how many people do I have to really think about here? After all, lots of people might be affected by my action. Now, the answer is, well, it really depends. A lot of our actions, and for most of us, it doesn't affect many people. Say, after this class, you have a free hour before your next class. What do you do with that hour? You could go back to your room, you could go to the library, you could go get something to eat, you could just sit around and hang out with friends, blah, 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 all sorts of things you could do. Now, how many other people are going to be affected by what you do? Probably not very many. I mean, maybe you're a serial killer and you're thinking, ooh, I did another murder. Then other people are going to be affected. But the way most of us act and the range of options we consider don't affect many other people. So we typically don't have to think a whole lot about the world as a whole. Will it make the world a better place if I just sit here and drink a Coke? We don't have to worry about that a lot. However, if you're a politician, let's say, it may be that millions of people will be affected by your action. And there are occasions where even an ordinary one of us might be affecting lots and lots of other people. I've been putting these philosophy classes and philosophy lectures up on YouTube for the last several years. And sometimes hardly anybody watches them. But there's one that over 80,000 people have watched. That's not something I really thought about when I put it up there. I hope that it has benefited them. But, you know, I've got to think about that intro. That's something that's making all these public that could affect lots of other people. And so I need to think about the effects of that. If I'm actually governor of Texas, what I do is going to affect many more people, and so I need to take all of that much more seriously and heavily into account. So how much I have to think about the welfare of others here, and how much I have to think about my own happiness, depends on what I'm doing. Mill basically says most of the time we can think primarily of our own happiness, and those are the people immediately around us. Because we're not doing anything very momentous that's going to affect large numbers of people. But we might be doing something that could affect lots of people, and then we have to worry about the total sum of happiness, so we have to think about everyone. Now, if you think carefully about what Bentham and Mill have said, they aren't telling you what you have to do. They aren't giving you a criterion of obligation. They are instead establishing a scale. Acts are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. And so they're telling you what is better and worse. They're not really directly telling you what you have to do. They're establishing a scale like this. And so assume that the zero here is just having no effect on the world at all. You're not making it better, you're not making it worse. And then, for example, I chose a certain pair of socks today. Which pair of socks? Presumably it neither makes the world better or worse that I chose a particular pair of socks. Luckily these pants are long enough nobody can see them anyway. Okay, so it doesn't make any difference. And so that's sort of a zero option. Makes no difference at all to anyone. But now, there could be options that I'm deciding on. Let's say there are 4 of these. 2 of them make the world a better place. Okay, they improve happiness overall. Maybe they just affect me and it's my happiness that is really at stake here. But maybe I'm deciding whether or not to go to war. And actually this is something that will affect the welfare of millions of people. Anyway, option 1 here actually is the best. It most promotes happiness. Option 2 promotes happiness still. It makes the world a better place, but not quite as much. Option 3 makes the world a little worse. Option 4 makes it a lot worse. And so what we've got here is a criterion for what's better than what. We say option 1 is better than 2, which is better than 3, which is better than 4. Okay? And now if you say, well, what do I have to do? What are the choices that are morally permissible for me to make? We need to be told something else to determine that. Do I have to choose the best one, for example? Or is it okay to choose option 2? Making the world a better place, but not as well as I could have done, perhaps. Anyway, so far we don't have an answer to the question, what should I do? Or what must I do? What do I absolutely have to do from a moral point of view? What should I really be doing, even if it's more than the minimum that I really have to do? And the issue that arises as soon as we think about this question is what philosophers refer to as the issue of supererogatory acts. Now that's a long and hideous word, supererogatory. But what it means is going above and beyond the call of duty. There are certain things you have to do, but then other things that would be heroic for you to do. Not just meeting your obligations, but actually going well beyond. So, give me an example of something like that. Something that is not something you would require someone to do from a moral point of view, but nevertheless you would count as an outstanding thing to do morally. Could there be such a thing? Yeah.
Like a bystander helping someone out of like a burning house or something?
Good, a bystander helping someone out of a burning house. You are, let's say, walking home, you see this house on fire. You see somebody inside. Maybe they are knocked out, or maybe they are calling for help. What do? Well, what are you required to do? Okay, yeah, you're at least required to call 911 and get help. Right? I mean, that's, if you just say, house burning down, that's bad, okay? You're not supposed to do that. You've got to at least try to summon help. But now, are you morally required to go into the house and try to help? No. On the other hand, is it a morally good thing if you do? Now, it depends, right, on how capable you are of helping. If you end up just running into the burning house to try to help and just get consumed with the flames yourself, you might say, well, that wasn't a very wise thing. Like the person who doesn't know how to swim saying, I'll help you when they see someone drowning in the lake. If you can't do it, then actually it seems dumb, not heroic exactly to do this. But suppose you actually think you can save the person, you go rushing in, you do manage to save them. That, you might say, was like option one here. You didn't have to go that far. On the other hand, it's a superb thing. It was the best action available to you, even though it's not required. And so some versions of utilitarianism are going to say there are supererogatory acts, acts that involve going above and beyond the call of duty, heroic acts, if you want to think of that. Other times, you could answer in such a way as to collapse these questions and say, no, you've always got to do the best thing. So, some philosophers are going to draw a line between what I should do and what I must do. They're going to say, well, you must at least do this. But of course, the best thing would be to do that. Maybe that's what you really ideally ought to do. But you're not required. They draw a distinction between those two notions. Others say, no, what must I do? What should I do? That comes to the same thing. So there are two ways of trying to map this scale onto what you ought to do and what you must do. Sometimes it looks as if it's enough to do, well, to make the world a better place, or to choose one of the better options. So here is how Bentham puts it in the Principles of Morals and Legislation. An action may then be said to be conformable to the principle of utility, or for shortness sake, utility. Meaning, with respect to the community at large, anyone might be affected by this action, when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. In our scale, he's saying, as long as you're above zero, you're okay. Okay? You're going to count as satisfying the demands of utility when you're adding to the happiness of the world. You're adding to the happiness of the community. So option 1 and option 2 in our scale would both be acceptable on that version of the principle. Because the idea is here, look, you have to do enough. You have to at least make the world a better place, as he phrases it. This is sometimes called a satisficing version of utilitarianism. That's another ugly philosophical word, but it comes from the Latin. It just means doing enough. And so satis is just enough. And the rest has to do with doing or making. So it's really just doing enough. And it says, look, you've got to do enough. You don't have to do the best thing, but you've got to do good enough. You've got to do well enough. And that's what this says. Just do enough. There's a well-known paper about this where the author basically says, I was moving to North Carolina. I was looking for a house. The realtor showed me a house. It was within my price range. I liked it. So I just said, I'll buy it. And the realtor said, no, you want to look at some other options? I mean, maybe there's a house that's better for you. The guy said, nah, this one's good enough. And so he bought that house. That's the kind of thing this version of utilitarianism would say is entirely reasonable. You've got certain criteria here, in this case, improving the happiness of the community. Hey, you're doing it. You're doing enough. You're good to go. Okay? And that is one way of taking all of this. So the idea here is, look, a good act is one that improves the balance of pleasure over pain in the community. It makes everybody happier. Not every individual person, but it makes the totality happier, better off. A bad act actually decreases that. It creates more pain than pleasure. It makes people on balance worse off. Now the best acts maximize the balance of pleasure over pain, maximize the amount of happiness produced, but you don't have to do that, according to this view. That's a really good thing. Maybe ideally you ought to do it. On the other hand, you really have to only do enough. Well, that is not the only way. In fact, it's not become the most common way of taking utilitarianism, though it's increasing in popularity again. In 1789, the year of the French Revolution, when Bentham published this work, that seemed to be the version he was putting forward. Later in his life, however, he decided, wait a minute, maybe that's too loose. Maybe I need to require that people actually do the best possible thing. And so later he actually changed this. Now, the way this stands as it appears here, really what you should do maybe, ideally what you ought to do is option one, but you must do at least one or two. You must make the world a better place. And it's possible to go above and beyond the call of duty. Duty just requires that you do at least two, but you could do one instead. So one becomes something like a heroic action on this view. On the other hand, you could say, no, that's not enough. You actually have to maximize happiness. You have to maximize the good. And so on that view, you would say, choose the best action. And this is how he put it later in a work called The Constitutional Code, that he actually never finished. He was writing it for a period of 20 years and died before he could finish it. But in the Constitutional Code, here's how he puts it. The greatest happiness of the whole community ought to be the end or object of pursuit. The right and proper end of government in every political community is the greatest happiness of all the individuals of which it's composed. That is to say, in other words, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And that becomes a very famous phrase, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It's sort of unfortunate because it implies that there are two things you're trying to maximize, the number of people and also the amount of happiness. I think what he really means is just the greatest amount of happiness in the whole community. And so there's really just one thing, happiness, and you're trying to maximize that. But by this point, at any rate, he says, no, you have to do the best thing. So you should and must choose option one there. It's not enough to just make the world a little better. You should be constantly asking, what can I do to make the world as good as I can possibly make it? And that's what you're required to do. Well, if that's what you're required to do, of course, there's no way to do something morally heroic. You're always required to do the best thing. So there's no such thing as going above and beyond the call of duty. Duty always calls you to do the best possible thing. Now, utilitarianism, whichever version we take, is a version of consequentialism. It says that in the end, all moral value depends on consequences. So an act's value depends on its consequences, on the effects, on the amount of good. We look at results. It's a very results-oriented theory. Yeah?
So what we were talking before, was that kind of moral thinking?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What you were saying before, was that categorical kind of moral thinking, like just the best of all and not consequences be what they might?
Oh, well, best is defined in terms of consequences. Okay, so the question is really, there is one principle here that never has exceptions. It is basically produce happiness, okay? But now, what exactly am I required to do? Produce some happiness, produce as much happiness as I possibly can. That's the difference here. But both are saying, look at results. And so there is a categorical principle that says no matter what you're doing right now, no matter what situation you're in, no matter who you are to be acting to promote happiness, the happiness of the whole world. But now, really it's a question of how much happiness you have to produce. That's where these differ. But they're all looking at consequences. They're looking at effects. So this is a principle that says you've got to look at the effects of your action and choose the one that will tend to produce the best outcome. Okay? If it's a maximizing version, or at least produce a good enough outcome, if it's that satisficing version. So all of these are approaches that are going to say, look, I am talking about the effects of your action, and in particular, the effects on the amount of good in the world. And I want you to produce good. as much good as possible, or at least enough good that we can say you've satisfied your moral duty. But it's all a question of consequences. The second thing that is a feature of this theory is that it's a universalist theory. Everyone's good counts, and everyone's good counts equally. So when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about just amounts of good in the universe, and we're interested in producing amounts of good, enough good, or maximizing the amount of good in the universe. That's the idea. So we're looking at effects on the amount of good, but it doesn't matter whether it's my good or your good, whether it's my happiness, for example, or your happiness. What matters is just amounts of happiness, no matter who has them. So Bentham says at one point, look, each counts for one, and no one counts for more than one. And that's an important part of the utilitarian framework. We are interested in maximizing good in the universe, but it doesn't matter to whom that particular good is attached. Now, in saying that we focus on effects, on consequences, am I saying that intentions and motives and states of character don't matter? Not at all. It's just that they matter in a way that's derived from consequences. So here's how we might set it up, for example. We could say, what is it for an action to be good? It's for it to have good consequences. What is it for an intention to be good? It produces good actions. What is it for a motive to be good? It tends to lead to good intentions. What about a state of character? Well, a trait of character is good if it tends to lead to good motives. A person is good if you tend to have good character traits. You might even say a whole community or society is good if it tends to have good members. And so the idea here really is that I can still talk about whether a society is good, a community is good, a person is good, a character trait is good. I can still talk about virtues, and I can talk about motives and intentions and all of that. It's just that all of that is indirectly defined in terms of, ultimately, the goodness of results. And so what is a good motive? It tends to lead to good intentions, which tends to lead to good actions. They're the ones that tend to lead to good results. Okay? What is a virtue? It's a trait of character that will tend to lead you to have the right motives, which will tend to lead you to have the right intentions, to do the right actions, to then produce the right results. And so in the end, all of that can matter. The utilitarian can say, look, I care about motives. I care whether you killed that person on purpose or not. But I care all because, not because of the consequence being different, but because of things that are all tied to consequences in certain ways. Now, so far I've already let the cat out of the bag with this, but any utilitarian has to say, well, I am trying to maximize, or I'm trying to get enough of some good. But what is it that I'm interested in maximizing? What is it that I'm interested in having enough of? Well, the utilitarian needs a theory of the basic good, the basic thing that is going to establish that scale to tell me what's better than what. It's going to be defined in terms of amounts of something, but what is that thing? Now, different utilitarians have put in different things for that basic good that establishes the scale. So, what is that to be? I could say, I want to satisfy as many desires as possible. And some utilitarians have said that. I could say, I want to actually maximize virtues. And some people who are quasi-utilitarians have said that. But Bentham and Mill don't. They instead take a page from Aristotle. They say, what I am interested in maximizing, what is really the basic good that all action is oriented to, is happiness. So the idea here is, I want to make the world a better place in the sense of making the world happy. That's what it is for something to be better than something else, happier than something else. Okay, or at least tending to produce more happiness than that other thing. So happiness is the ultimate goal. But what is happiness? Now remember, in Aristotle, that was a very broad concept. It was eudaimonia, living well, thriving, flourishing. And there were lots of components to that. Here, it's not nearly so complicated. For Bentham and Mill, what is happiness? Very simple. Pleasure in the absence of pain. When are you happy? When you're experiencing pleasure, is their answer. So give me some examples of circumstances under which you're happy. What are moments of your life you think back and you say, whoa, I was really happy when, yeah, Texas won. When Texas won. Ah, yes. Okay, that was an amazing game. And you might say, wow, that was a moment I was happy. Now, think about that. Why were you happy? What were you experiencing at that moment? Sorry? Euphoria, yeah, euphoria. And really, Bentham and Mill say that's a kind of pleasure, right? You're there, and it's so sweet because it was such a tense game that went on for so long. You know, we used to start the season typically with some school that was sort of pathetic as a way of getting in a little extra practice. And so there have been games I went to at the beginning of the season where we won like 72-13. And then at the end you say, yes! No, it's kind of like, oh man, you know, there was no doubt from the first quarter what was going to happen in that game. But this game wasn't like that. It was tense, keeps you on the edge of your seat, and finally, yes, you're very happy at the end when Texas wins, and that's a case where you're experiencing a particular kind of pleasure. Now, Bentham says, don't think all pleasure is strictly sensual pleasure. There are many, many different kinds of pleasure, and that sort of euphoria, that sort of joy of victory, that is one particular kind of pleasure. Now think of a really bad time in your life. Yeah.
Final exam week.
Final exam week, okay. Yeah, final exam week might be a really lousy week. What makes it bad? Anxiety, yeah, anxiety is a kind of pain, okay? Now, not direct physical pain. It's not pain in exactly the same sense that this is pain. But nevertheless, it's painful, right? You're worried, you're thinking, oh, what if I fail? What if I fail? Blah, 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 blah. And it can be there can be physical pain involved. I went to a college where we were allowed to pick up our exams and then go to any room to take this. And so I just went off with my economics exam, first semester, ended up sitting in this room, was there scribbling, found myself blowing in my hands. It was a really, really cold day, snow-covered Philadelphia day, here I am blowing. Anyway, it was about 2 hours into the exam when I realized nobody turned the heat on in this room. That's why it's so cold. I at first thought, man, I'm so nervous, I'm feeling really cold, that's weird. And it kept going, getting worse and worse, and it's like, the colder I got, the faster I wrote. I did writing. I filled up like 3 blue books of stuff. I ended up writing more than 40 pages on this economics exam. I think just because my hand was in danger of freezing, so it was like, right. I was pulling a Jeremy Bentham there. But anyway, yeah, so that was painful in that more direct sense of like I'm really, really cold, but it was also painful because I was filled with anxiety, and so that's a particular kind of pain as well. So here is their idea. All happiness really comes down to pleasure in the absence of pain. All unhappiness comes down to the presence of pain, the absence of pleasure. And they are therefore what is known as hedonists, philosophically. A hedonist is not just someone who grabs for all the gusto they can in the popular sense, but in the philosophy it means somebody who thinks the ultimate sources of value are pleasure and pain. In fact, the beginning of the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham lays it out and says, pleasure and pain are our two masters. They govern everything we do and everything we ought to do. And so they are ultimately the ends of action. They are the things that are the ultimate sources of value. And that's what hedonism in a philosophical sense is. Pleasure and pain is what everything else depends on. Yeah?
If they're describing pleasure is not just in a lot of respects, ways of success and ambition, etc., why is it that it's constantly limited to being like a Higgs theory or like something that just indulges and doesn't resort to?
Ooh, all right, good. Yeah, you're asking a great question. If pleasure includes all these different kinds of things, then how can some people like Thomas Carlyle object that it's really a philosophy fit for swine, that it's pig philosophy? Actually, that's coming up, so I'm going to, can we jump ahead to that? Maybe we can jump ahead to that. But the basic idea is going to be, what is a component of happiness for Aristotle that would not be just pleasure in the absence of pain? I said his notion of happiness was much fuller, involving thriving, flourishing, and so on. And he thinks that includes more than just pleasure in the absence of pain. Like what? What are some of the other things that Aristotle would say are intrinsic goods that should be part of a happy life? Yeah?
I forgot exactly what the word is, but like hard work, diligence.
Oh, good. All right. Hard work, accomplishment, achievement. You might think, look, at the end of my life, I want to be able to say I've accomplished something, I've achieved something, I've worked hard and actually attained my goals, or at least some goals, I've done something. And that would be something that, you could consider a pleasure. I think Bentham would say that's just another kind of pleasure, that feeling of accomplishment. People might say, no. I don't want to just feel a sense of accomplishment. I want to have accomplished something. Here is a way of trying to tease apart the difference. Robert Nozick came up with the idea of an experience machine. And the idea would be this. You have a way of plugging yourself in neurophysiologically to some machine that simulates all sorts of experiences, gives you a kind of virtual reality experience. Now, there are now virtual reality games, but they're not that consuming. It's not like you really feel like you're there fighting the dragon or whatever. But imagine that it got really good and that it could last an entire life. And so the person trying to sell you on the experience machine basically says, listen, all you have to do is sign this sheet of paper. You'll spend the rest of your life in a state of sort of suspended animation hooked up to this machine. So you will actually do nothing and accomplish nothing. You will be kept alive, but you'll lead this very rich emotional life. I mean, what do you think would be really cool to do? And you start thinking, oh, wow, okay, I want to be a rock and roll star. And then I want to do good for all sorts of people in the world. Then I want to be elected president of the United States. And then after that, gosh, what? I want to win the Nobel Prize in physics at the same time that I'm writing a brilliant novel and win the Nobel Prize in literature. The first person ever to do it, And so the experience machine person says, no problem, I'll program the machine. You'll have all those experiences. It will be as if to you have led that kind of life. The rock star turned president, turned Nobel Prize winning physicist, turned great literary figure, etc. But none of those things will really happen. You'll in fact be just this body hooked up to a bunch of tubes, lying somewhere. Okay? But you say, yeah, that's how I want to live. Would you choose to live with the experience machine? I mean, how many of you would say, yes, sign me up? I mean, free trial. Nobody, right? And so Lucic says, look, I want real accomplishment. I don't want just the pleasure of feeling like I've accomplished something. I want to really accomplish something. I want to really be virtuous. I don't want to have the feeling of being virtuous. I mean, the person in the experience machine might think, I'm so virtuous, I'm like the best person alive. But they're not really, they're just lying in some bed somewhere hooked up to a bunch of tubes and wires. And so in the end you could say, look, I don't want just the feeling of accomplishment, or the feeling of being a good person. I want to really accomplish something. I want to really be a good person. And so I think what Carlyle is objecting to is in one way, just that this identifies the good with feeling good. In the end, what is it to be good? It's just to feel good, okay? And to produce other people's feeling good. And he ends up saying, look, that's not the way a human being is supposed to behave. We want more than just feeling good, not just for ourselves, but for others. I want to actually achieve something. I want to accomplish something. I want to know something. I actually want to get at the truth. What if the truth would be unpleasant? And it would be, that the lie would make me happier. Basically, I said, no, I still want to know the truth. It's not enough to just feel good. Well, anyway, you get the idea. But we'll come back to this point. Now, Bentham does urge that we've got to consider not just ourselves, but everybody who might be affected. So it's not just me. That version would be egoism. No, this is really, I've got to consider anyone in the community, anybody who might be affected by my action. And he says, what is the effect on the community then? It's just the sum of the effects on the members. What does it mean to make the community happier? Just to make the people inside it happier. Okay, so there's nothing mystical about promoting a utopian vision here. What does it mean to improve the welfare of the community? Just to improve its people, individually speaking. Well, what are Bentham's arguments? Why should we be a utilitarian? He does have some arguments. And they are things I can lay out very simply. Part of it is contained in that idea that he's worried about superstition, about prejudice, about unconscious biases, about us thinking we're on the deep truths when it's really just based on a feeling. And so, I'll come back to that next time. But he says, look, common sense is something that can't fully be trusted. Now, it does generally agree with the principle of utility. So he said, to the extent that we can trust it, it's actually something we can completely explain by talking about the principle of utility. For example, what's wrong with stealing? Why is stealing bad? Yeah?
Because it's hurting the person you steal from.
Good, it's hurting the person you steal from. And indirectly, it hurts lots of other people because then they have to worry about their things being stolen. And so they have to invest in security systems and things like that. Somebody once tried to steal my car. They hotwired the thing. Luckily, the battery was dead, so they didn't get away with it. But anyway, if they had, it's not just that I would have been hurt because they would have stolen my car, but also, then it'd be like, oh gosh, car theft is something that has all sorts of ramifications for lots of other people. He also says arguments for other principles assume the principle of utility. Basically, they all have this structure. If people didn't follow this rule, bad things would happen. But I think his most powerful argument is one he puts in a footnote. We can resolve most moral conflicts, but we've got to have a measure of value that allows us to do it. Now, sometimes moral conflicts are really hard. They're conflicting considerations. We don't know what to do. There's a reason to do this and a reason to do the opposite. It's very hard to choose. On the other hand, he says a lot of times these conflicts are easy to resolve. So let's look at some from the history of philosophy. Here's one from Plato. Returning arms. A friend, when he's in his right mind, loans you a weapon of some kind, let's say a hunting knife or something like that, and then he asks for it back when he's not in his right mind. Guy comes, knocks on the door and says, hey, can I have my knife back? Say, oh, yeah, sure, let me get it. What's going on? He says, that guy who's next to me, one of the barking dog, I've had enough. I've heard enough barking. I'm going crazy. I'm going to go slit that dog's throat, then I'm going to kill him over. And you say, oh, sure, here's the knife. Now, how many of you say, yeah, I promise to give you this back, so sure, here's the knife. No, I mean, this is an easy one to resolve, right? You say, no, of course don't give him back the knife. Try to calm him down. And this is a case, in short, where actually the right thing to do is not to keep your promise, it's something else. And we decide that very quickly on the basis of utility. We say, very bad things will happen if I give back this knife. And so we make the judgment, it's easy, we have a common scale, namely the amount of happiness or unhappiness that will result. Here's another case, the infelicitous oath. This is from Gratian, a 12th century legal thinker. You swear to commit a crime, but then you have second thoughts. So some friends of yours, some really disreputable friends, kids you knew in high school, didn't go to UT, of course, decide they're gonna steal a car. Maybe a professor's car, okay? And you say, you're trying to be cool, you say, oh yeah, let me know, I'll help you. But then that time rolls around, and do you fulfill your promise and help them? How many of you say, well yeah, I promise I'm going to steal that car? No, you're not supposed to steal the car. How do we decide? You think about the consequences, okay? Now, are there occasions under which you might steal the car? Well, maybe if the consequences of the other side are bad enough. They say, listen man, you're not going to be in the gang? Then kill your entire family. Then maybe you say, okay, steal the car. Okay? But you think through the likely consequences, that's how you do it. And the same with other things. The murderous adulterer, his friend's having an affair. You promise to keep it a secret, but then it turns out he's going to try to kill the woman's husband. Do you still keep it a secret? Or the hiding fugitive, right? Well, you get the idea. That guy is trying to kill your friend. He's hiding in your place. He knocks on your door and says, is he there? You say yes. Next time you come back and look at John Stuart Mill